America's first in-flight space disaster was the fault of something almost ridiculously simple, a rubber gasket that had frozen overnight. On this crisp Tuesday morning on January 28, 1986, the sky above Cape Canaveral gleamed an electric blue, the kind of perfect winter morning that seemed destined for history. At the Kennedy Space Center, families filled the bleachers, bundled against the cold, waving small American flags and clutching cameras. Classrooms across the country tuned into the live broadcast. For millions of children, this wasn't just another shuttle launch. This was the day a teacher would go to space. Krista McAuliffe was a social studies teacher from New Hampshire who had captured the nation's heart. She wasn't a career astronaut, but rather a symbol of ordinary Americans daring to dream of the stars. Alongside her were 6 of NASA's finest. Commander Francis Dick Scobie, pilot Michael Smith, mission specialist Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, and Ronald McNair, plus payload specialist Gregory Jarvis. Together, they formed the Challenger crew, a team of skill, courage, and hope. At 11:38 a.m., the final countdown echoed across the launch pad. The hissing of steam belched out as the engines ignited, glowing white against cold air. The shuttle roared to life, shaking the ground beneath the spectators' feet. Cheers erupted as Challenger soared skyward, a bright streak against an endless blue sky. For 73 glorious seconds, everything seemed perfect, until at 11:39 a.m., a flash lit the heavens. The shuttle twisted briefly, then vanished into 2 curling trails of smoke. For a few moments, nobody knew what they were seeing. Children clapped in classrooms, believing it was part of the show. Inside Mission Control, silence fell, cold and absolute. Then the voice of Flight Director Jay Green came through. Flight controllers here are looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously, a major malfunction. The words froze the nation. America's pride had disintegrated before the eyes of the watching world just 73 seconds into its flight. The crowd at Cape Canaveral caught its collective breath, awaiting the shuttle's reappearance. It never came. In Mission Control, data gave way to static, telemetry disappeared, and voices tumbled over each other in confusion. Each engineer knew, deep inside, that something irreparable had just occurred. The families stared into the expanding white smoke, trying somehow to make sense of what it could mean. "Is that supposed to happen?" one asked. "Maybe that's a separation," another answered. But the truth was terrible. The O-ring of the right solid rocket booster had failed to seal properly, hardened by the freezing temperatures. A small jet of flame escaped, burning through a joint and striking the external fuel tank. In an instant, the liquid hydrogen and oxygen ignited, tearing the shuttle apart 30,000 feet above the Atlantic. There were no parachutes, no ejection seats, no emergency signals, only falling debris and twin trails of smoke marking where the solid booster spun away, still burning. On live television, anchors fell silent as disbelief turned to horror. Theories spread. Was an explosion? Could the crew have survived? Had the orbiter stayed intact? In minutes, all hope faded when NASA declared an emergency. Coast Guard and Navy ships sped toward the debris field. What had begun as a mission of discovery became a search for survivors, and soon, for truth. Orders went out from Houston's control rooms to Florida's coast. Helicopters, ships, and rescue teams scoured the Atlantic, clinging to the fragile hope that someone might be found alive. They searched for life rafts, beacons, or even a bright orange flight suit among the waves. For hours, aircraft crisscrossed the ocean in grid patterns beneath the pale winter sun. But inside NASA, few truly believed survival was possible. The shuttle had broken apart at nearly 48,000 feet. The forces were unimaginable. By afternoon, debris began to surface. Insulation, scorched tiles, a torn section of fuselage. Rescue turned to recovery. Hope turned to grief. The Atlantic that evening was eerily calm, lit only by searchlights reflecting off fragments of machinery that had once carried 7 souls toward the edge of space. Divers marked each find with buoys, descending into dark, silent depths where the ocean kept its terrible secret. That night, Houston received confirmation. The debris field stretched across hundreds of square miles. There were no survivors. Mission Control, The very same room that had erupted in cheers just hours before was now silent except for the low hum of machines. Engineers replayed the final data, watching the last flicker of telemetry stop mid-pulse. A triumph of human ambition had ended as a moment of national heartbreak. In the days that followed, the Atlantic became the center of one of the largest recovery missions in U.S. history. Every branch of the military joined in, alongside hundreds of civilian specialists. The mission was no longer about rescue. It was about understanding, piecing together what went wrong, and seeing that the sacrifice of Challenger's crew would never be forgotten. The U.S. Navy led the mission, deploying sonar ships, deep-sea submersibles, and dive teams to map the ocean floor. Helicopters and reconnaissance planes flew constant loops over the debris field, photographing every floating fragment, while Coast Guard vessels collected what they could from the surface: insulation, scorched wiring, and fragments of the shuttle's white tiles. Each item was tagged, cataloged, and sent to Kennedy's Space Center. To handle the growing complexity, NASA formed the Search, Recovery, and Reconstruction Task Force, a massive collaboration between NASA engineers, the Navy, the Air Force, NOAA, and civilian contractors. They divided the Atlantic into grids and began a systematic sweep. For the divers, conditions were harsh. Visibility underwater rarely exceeded a few feet, and the cold, murky currents made every descent slow and dangerous. Beneath them lay a field of wreckage stretching for miles, a grim metallic landscape. Some pieces were as small as a hand, others the size of cars. Each recovery brought both relief and sorrow: a section of the left wing, a landing gear strut, part of the external tank. Every discovery told a piece of the story and carried a weight of what it had once been, a machine that represented human ambition. By early February, ships had lifted thousands of fragments from the sea. More than 100 tons of debris were eventually recovered, almost half of Challenger's original mass. The pieces were transported to a massive hangar at Kennedy's Space Center, where engineers laid them out on the floor like an enormous jigsaw puzzle. Using steel frames, they began to reconstruct the orbiter's outline, carefully marking where each piece belonged. Investigators studied burn patterns, fracture angles, and the colors of the long metal joints. It was forensic engineering on an unprecedented scale. From the twisted remains, they began tracing the disaster backward, from the explosion to ignition, to the single failing O-ring that had allowed a tongue of flame to pierce the fuel tank. But as the days stretched into weeks, one question remained unanswered. Among all the wreckage, one crucial section was still missing: the crew compartment. Somewhere beneath the dark Atlantic, the cabin which had carried 7 astronauts into the sky waited to be found. And when it finally was, what they found would change how the world understood those final seconds. By March 1986, over a month after the Challenger disaster, recovery teams had mapped virtually every square mile of the debris field. Thousands of fragments had been lifted from the sea, but one critical piece was still missing: what everyone involved in the search called the crew compartment, the heart of the shuttle, whose absence left a haunting gap in the investigation. The search shifted focus as Navy sonar operators began scanning deeper, tracing echoes across the seabed for any shape large enough to be the cabin. The Atlantic off Florida's coast is deceptively shallow, about 100 feet deep, but the water was cold and heavy with silt. Every sonar ping returned ghostly shapes that had to be checked by divers or submersibles. On March 7th, the USS Preserver reported a sonar contact unlike the rest, a large irregular object half buried in the sand about 18 miles east of Cape Canaveral. Divers descended into the murk, guided by floodlights. As the shape came into view, silence filled their headsets. It wasn't twisted metal from a booster or a fragment of wing. It was a forward section of the orbiter, the crew cabin. The discovery hit everyone on board with the weight of finality. For weeks, people had whispered that the cabin might still be intact somewhere below, holding answers nobody wanted to face. Now it was real. The wreckage lay at a depth of just over 100 feet, heavily fragmented, but unmistakably part of Challenger's forward fuselage. Recovery began immediately. Divers worked carefully, fastening cables and flotation devices, lifting each section to the surface with precision. They handled the cabin with extraordinary care, treating it not as debris, but as sacred ground. Once aboard the recovery ship, Navy and NASA officials sealed off the area from the press. The ship's decks went quiet as the crew stood in solemn silence. The cabin's condition told a grim story. Much of it was crushed and torn apart by the ocean's impact, but enough remained to reconstruct the final sequence of events. Investigators confirmed that in the explosion, the crew compartment had separated largely intact from the rest of the orbiter, continuing on a ballistic path for nearly 2 minutes before slamming into the ocean at over 200 miles per hour in impact. No one could have survived. The wreckage was taken under guard to Kennedy Space Center, where engineers, forensic specialists, and pathologists began their most difficult work. Inside the hangar, the cabin was reassembled piece by piece under strict supervision. The point was not spectacle or blame, it was to understand what had happened inside those last 73 seconds, and to bring home the people who had been lost inside it. When the recovered wreckage reached Kennedy, the atmosphere changed. The work had always been technical. Now it became deeply personal. Engineers, astronauts, and investigators walked wordlessly among the scorched fragments. Each piece was tagged, logged, and laid out on steel frames that outlined the shuttle's original shape. In one corner, the remains of the crew cabin were cordoned off, guarded, and covered from view. The investigation which followed was one of the most meticulous in NASA's history. Using telemetry data, launch footage, and recovered hardware, the agency reconstructed the final seconds of Challenger's flight frame by frame. What they discovered was both illuminating and devastating. At liftoff, the right solid rocket booster's bottom joint had already begun leaking hot gas. The cold that morning, a rare freeze for Florida, had stiffened the O-ring seal meant to contain it. As the shuttle climbed, cameras captured a small flicker of flame along the booster's side. Later, engineers would confirm that the leak widened with every second, eating through the joint's protective casing. Then at precisely 73 seconds into flight, the flame burned through the external fuel tank, igniting the massive reservoirs of liquid hydrogen and oxygen and triggering the explosion that tore Challenger apart. Next came the most haunting revelation. Data and recovered evidence showed the crew cabin had not been destroyed in the explosion. The forward fuselage detached in one piece and continued upward in an arc before beginning its fatal fall toward the Atlantic. For 2 long minutes, it remained structurally intact, tumbling through the sky. Inside, investigators believed the astronauts were alive, though probably unconscious within seconds due to rapid depressurization. The violent breakup had severed oxygen lines and electrical systems, plunging compartment into darkness. Switch positions on recovered control panels suggested that Commander Scobie and pilot Michael Smith tried to fire emergency systems during the fall, but the shuttle had no ejection seats, no escape module. There was nothing they could do. Impact data told the rest of the story. The cabin hit the ocean at nearly 200 miles per hour, creating forces far beyond survivability.